Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michael Waldman. I'm the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. And together with our partners at the NYU Law Review, we want to welcome you to the second part of this exciting symposium on voting and representation and the new challenges that we all face. For those of you who don't know the Brennan Center, we are a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We work to strengthen, to reform, to renew, and when necessary, to defend the systems of democracy and justice in the United States. We work to make sure that American institutions live up to the best of American values. And as you can imagine, in this election year, we are deeply engaged in the effort across the country, in states and nationally, to protect the vote, to make sure that our democracy works, to make sure that people can have their voices heard at this critical time for the country. This symposium is an important part of understanding that work and understanding the challenges facing the country. We believe very strongly that the institutions of American democracy urgently need repair, that we are in many ways engaged in a great fight for the future of American democracy, and especially to make sure that that democracy works for all Americans at a time of massive demographic change, at a time of a long overdue reckoning with racial injustice and systemic racism, at a time when we want our system to work and we want our government to work. Now, last week, we all had the privilege of hearing from some brilliant scholars and practitioners in our first session, which addressed the very novel, thorny challenge of how to run an election, a meaningful and free and fair and safe election during a pandemic. We heard from Stacey Abrams and from scholars and activists who've been thinking about, working on, and living with those issues. Today, in the second part of the symposium, in some respects, you could say we're going deeper because we are looking at some of the most profound questions facing our democracy at a time of growing, massive, and ongoing demographic change. We all know the country is becoming less white, more black and brown, more diverse, and that the institutions of American government have to keep up, have to be representative, have to work for the America that is becoming, not just the America that was. We're going to hear two terrific panels today, one on how to ensure fair representation in an increasingly diverse America. What are the obstacles? What does that even mean at a moment like this and going forward? And the second panel is going to look at the question of what are the structural and institutional barriers to building a more inclusive democracy? And what are some of the new ways of thinking that can help us overcome some of the creaky mechanisms of the American constitutional system or of our democratic system that, as we all know, makes it work not very well or entrenches the power of minorities to block needed change and needed activity, and that could become an increasingly problematic and reactionary force in our society if we don't do better. Our mission here, to quote Abraham Lincoln at another time of great change, is to think anew. And if we can think anew about the challenges facing our democracy, then we can save the country. A few important matters to mention. First of all, as you know, it is an election year. I don't know if folks have heard that, but it is. And I want to make clear that the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization. We do not participate in elections. We do not endorse or oppose candidates. And this symposium will reflect that. We want to also say thank you to our partners in pulling this together. So first of all, of course, that is the NYU Law Review, which is dedicated to shaping the legal field by representing the rich diversity of ideas, of identities, and viewpoints within the greater society. It's a very special law review, and this symposium, I think, reflects that. Another partner in putting this together is the John Brademas Center of NYU. It advocates for civil debate In our politics, it is named after the late Congressman John Brademas, who was the president of NYU and who reflected that in his own values and in his own work. And the organization NYU Votes, which strives to give every eligible student, an NYU student, the information they need, which is especially tough these days when everyone is scattered to the winds and finding it harder to know how to vote in this crazy pandemic year. You can find out from them, nyu.edu/NYU-votes for lots of resources, and I hope I got that right. I also want to thank my colleagues at the Brennan Center for Justice who worked with others to pull this together at a time when we're all challenged to be fighting to protect the right to vote and representation at the same time. Our colleagues Madiba Denny, Alicia Bannon, and Julia Boland, and the terrific events team at the Brennan Center, Melon O'Keefe, Jeannie Park, and Adrienne Yee. Thank you to everybody who put so much energy and time into making this come together. Now, the very exciting announcement for some of us, which is that for attorneys who are in New York who are viewing this symposium is eligible for continuing legal education, CLE credits. You will hear 3 to 5 codes announced during the course of the afternoon so that you can record your attendance and not only learn about our democracy, learn about how to improve it, but also work toward those CLE credits, which of course is so important to so many of us and so hard during the pandemic. Now I would like to turn it over to my colleague, the managing editor of the NYU Law Review, Safina Leila McCly, who will tell you about this symposium and what we're aiming for. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Safina Leila McCly, and I'm a third-year student at the New York University School of Law, and I'm also one of the managing editors of the New York University Law Review. Now, as many of you know, Stacey Abrams had this speaking slot last week. So when I was preparing what I would say to you all today, I thought maybe I should just copy word for word exactly what Stacey Abrams said, and then everyone would think it was a great speech. But my fellow Law Review editors counseled me against doing that, and that is probably for the best. So instead, in my brief 5 minutes with you all this afternoon, and before turning us over to our 2 incredible panels on representation that we have this afternoon, I wanted to take the chance to do 3 things. First, and echoing Michael, I wanted to share a note of thanks. This symposium would not be possible without the incredible staff at the Brennan Center, especially Alicia, Madiba, Julia, Annie, Melon, and the events team. When a bunch of law students approach you with a big idea to have a big event, and then a global pandemic happens that forces that entire event to move online, most people would run in the opposite direction, not the Brennan Center. They have been supportive, super competent, and an incredible partner. I also want to thank the staff of the Law Review, especially our senior board, who put hours into planning this symposium, our articles department, who will select the papers that we'll publish in our symposium issue about voting and representation next year, as well as our editors who helped with planning, marketing, live tweeting, which is obviously very important, and promoting this event. And they did all of that while being full-time law students in the middle of a pandemic. I also want to thank the many people at NYU Law who support the Law Review, including our dean, Trevor Morrison, our dean of students, Lindsay Kendrick, and our faculty and faculty advisor, including Troy McKenzie. And a final thank you to our sponsors for today's event, NYU Votes and the Brademas Center at NYU. Second, I want to talk briefly about how this symposium came to be. Every year, the managing editor in my role is in charge of soliciting proposals from NYU Law's excellent centers and institutes for our annual symposium. This year, we are excited to seek a proposal for a symposium that addressed urgent concerns in an unprecedented year, with diverse panelists and a clear call to action. We received many proposals, and all of them were excellent. And we debated the merits of having each of those conversations in 2020. We landed on the conclusion that, of course, what else could we be talking about in 2020 but voting and representation? And who better to do that with than the Brennan Center? As law students, we spend our time, mostly virtually now, reading, writing, and discussing what it means to be a part of the group perpetuating, holding up, and hopefully changing the legal institutions that built and sustain our country. In 2020, while our democracy feels on the brink of either great change or a great loss of confidence, we felt that it was urgent to hold space to talk about what the paths are to move forward. We wanted to talk about what promises this country made that are left unfulfilled. And more, we wanted to talk about what promises were never made at all, that left many of us out of the conversation and without representation. In selecting our symposium this year, we wanted to bring more than law students and law professors to the virtual table, which in this case is a YouTube live stream and an excellent and active comment box. We wanted to bring communities, activists, practitioners, fighters, people from all over the country together to talk about what it means to be represented in America today. We're so grateful to our incredible panelists, both last week and today, for leading us in that conversation. Finally, I want to end my remarks this afternoon with just a few words about me. I identify as Muslim, bisexual, a millennial, a woman of color. In the US, women make up just 36% of lawyers, Asians just 3%. It means so much to me to be here with you speaking about the law today. I'm also an immigrant. I moved to the United States in 2001, 6 months before 9/11, and I didn't count formally until 2013. I turned 18, and instead of celebrating that I could now vote, and I am a total nerd, so that is absolutely what I was most excited to be celebrating when I turned 18. Instead, I had to hold tightly to my green card and rely on my friends to exercise their right to vote and hope they considered my best interests when they were doing that. In 2012, with a small team at UC Berkeley, I registered 4,000 students to vote in just 3 months, all before I was eligible to vote myself. Why? Because as a young girl, I never imagined Muslims in Congress. I never imagined young women of color being heralded as the future of the Democratic Party. I never imagined Kamala Harris on a vice presidential debate stage like she was last night. I never imagined that we could push for a more just, greener, more inclusive democracy and through the electoral process. But slowly I started to see things change. And when I cast my vote for the first time in 2013, I felt the incredible privilege of what it means to be counted. But I also felt the weight of hope. The hope that one day, maybe, I would be represented too. Representation, the theme of today's panels, is an acknowledgement that there is so much more to do beyond voting to make our institutions more representative and look more like the people that they serve. Thank you all for joining us in that important conversation today. And with that, and with my thanks for your time, I'll hand it off to our first panel of the day, Fair Representation in an Increasingly Diverse America, moderated by Michael Lee of the Brennan Center.
Thank you. I'm Michael Lee, Senior Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice, and I'm delighted to kick off the second day of our symposium with our esteemed panelists to talk about a topic that will be undoubtedly one of the big stories of this decade, the increased diversity of the country and how we as a nation, how we as a people, for better or for worse, respond to it. And it occurred to me as we were putting together this panel that it's somewhat appropriate that we are having this discussion in the week that is the 55th anniversary of the enactment of the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965, which in many ways helped set the stage for where we are today as a country. In 1965, this was mostly a white country. Black Americans were about 10% of the country and still heavily concentrated in the South and in northern cities. Latinos were only about 3% of the population and Asians barely 1%. because of things like the Chinese Exclusion Act. Flash forward 55 years, and Latinos are now estimated to be about 19% of the population, Asians about 6%, and the fastest growing group in the country. And the country's Black population is now almost 13%. And as people of color, we don't live where we used to either. Half of all Asians, half of all Latinos, and half of all Black Americans in the urban areas now live in the suburbs rather than in cities. And you're seeing that play out in this year's election and it's in national politics bigly, as President Trump might say. And yet, in many ways, representation hasn't kept up, in part because the legal framework that we use for getting additional representation was designed literally for a Black and white world, and oftentimes doesn't work very well for groups like Latinos and Asians. But also, in part because of other sorts of barriers, and sometimes, let's be frank, very intentional barriers. Something I know all too well about, having lived for a long time in Texas. And that means that we don't have the democracy that John Adams envisioned in 1776. One, as he wrote, where the nation's representative body should be exact portraits, miniatures of the people writ large. And some people are perfectly happy with it that way. So let's talk about how we can have a more representative representation with our excellent panel, who I will introduce in alphabetical order because there is no other fair way to do it. First off, we have Professor Ming Su of the University of Colorado Law School. She is faculty director of the Immigration and Citizenship Law Program and holds faculty affiliations in political science and ethnic studies as well. Among her other many distinctions, she is a graduate of NYU School of Law, and although in the normal world we will be welcoming her back to New York City and back to Washington Square, we can't do that, but in this symposium we can at least give her a big virtual welcome back to New York. Next, we have Professor Atiba Ellis from Marquette University Law School, where he's a professor of law focusing on voting rights with specific attention to how varying conceptions of the right to vote exclude voters on the margin. And last but not least, we are joined by Tom Saenz, President and General Counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, a longtime fighter in the trenches for fair Latino representation and a longtime friend of the Brennan Center. And so with that, let's get started. I'm going to start with Tom and just ask this question. Latinos are now, in this election, going to be the largest non-white group of voters in the country for the first time. As I mentioned earlier, the growth of Latinos has been extraordinarily fast, especially in the last 2 decades, but representation hasn't kept up. What makes it hard for Latinos to achieve fair representation in America today, and what are the biggest barriers, legal, structural, cultural?
Well, I think you have to start with the fact that that growth is a threat to the existing political power structure in the United States. And that means moves will be made to attempt to limit the growth of that political power. And we've seen that throughout the country, including in your former state of Texas and in California, where I sit today, but really throughout the United States. The reaction to the growth of communities of color is often to retrench, to try to make it harder to register to vote, to make it harder to actually cast a ballot on election day or in advance of election day, and certainly to use the existing structures of power to prevent the elimination or the removal of incumbents from power and put in place representatives of those new and growing communities. So we see this in attempts to change the rules around voter registration. We've seen a number of states attempt to require new voter registrants to provide documentary proof of their U.S. citizenship, something that was not required and is not required of those who registered previously. We've seen attempts to purge voters from the rolls based on faulty data, including last year in Texas, where they accessed data they knew to be faulty with respect to citizenship at the Department of Motor Vehicles and attempted to tell 100,000 voters that we don't think you have the right to vote. And even that accusation, whether supported by fact or not, in this case not, still is intimidating to voters. And of course, that particular purge was targeted at naturalized voters, those who had been immigrants previously and not yet citizens when they initially went to the DMV and had since become citizens and so registered to vote. We also, of course, see the use of those structures, like the redistricting power structure, to preserve incumbents in power and prevent newly growing communities from achieving the power that their growth would otherwise dictate. We've seen it over and over, as you know, Michael, in Texas, where every decade we have to fight out how new seats in the House of Representatives will be allocated, even though we know that the very reason those new seats have come to the state of Texas is precisely because of the growth of communities of color, but the legislature has been traditionally resistant to drawing those new seats in a way that recognizes the growth of those communities. And the last thing I would say, because it is so prominent today, is we have these ongoing and unsupported allegations of voter fraud that more and more seem to target immigrant communities, communities that are new and growing in size and power throughout the country, and are often then accused, even today, by the person in the White House over his years in power, of engaging in widespread voter fraud. And that myth of voter fraud, that myth that folks are in large numbers voting when they don't have the right to do so, is in itself, by itself, a threat that intimidates voters in newly growing communities from participating. When that myth of voter fraud translates into policy change, like some of the ones I've described, it has an even more pernicious effect on the power that should go with the growth of these communities of color.
Thank you, Tom. Professor Chen, we now have more immigrants in the US than any time since the great wave of European immigration before the First World War. This time, though, of course, the new immigrants are disproportionately Latino and Asian. I count my own family as part of that. Can you talk a little bit about what barriers immigrant communities face to becoming full members of our political community today?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me today. As you mentioned in your introduction, I am a graduate of NYU Law School and also a graduate of the Senior Executive Board at NYU Law Review. So it is indeed nice to join you today. To your question, though, I mean, I do want to address the extent of demographic change and the complications that that change introduces for achieving the constitutional ideal of a representational equality. I think that one thing to understand is that with the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, not only did the racial minority population in the United States multiply, primarily by including Asian Americans and Latinos, the number of immigrants writ large also increased. So the Latino population, as has already been established, is currently the largest immigrant population, one of the largest newly naturalized populations in the United States. Asian Americans are the fastest growing. And in fact, in 50 years, Asian Americans are on track to even surpass the size of the Latino population, reaching 38% of the immigrant population in the United States. So I think there are some particular challenges that come with this increased diversity, especially in the Asian American and Latino population. And I think the first of those is just a conceptual issue of understanding that immigrants are in fact part of our political community. So that if there is a constitutional command for representational equality, it includes immigrants as well as US citizens. Let's just pause for a moment to consider that. It might seem odd for me to talk about the rights of political participation by talking about the rights of non-citizens. And I think that's because we primarily think about voting as the barometer of political participation. But voting is only one aspect of being represented in the United States. One thing that I really want to highlight is the role of the census and the necessity of counting the total population, including all racial minority populations and immigrants themselves, who are, by the Edict of the Constitution, considered part of that census count that is then used to apportion our districts and also to redistrict them as well. If you can picture a Venn diagram, the voting population, is restricted to the U.S. citizens, and the census would include the U.S. citizens and immigrants. That means legal permanent residents, temporary immigrants, undocumented immigrants. So when we talk about achieving total population versus shrinking that to a smaller voter eligible population, those immigrant groups are some of the ones that we leave out. And just understanding the extent of that and the consequences of that, I think there are social implications, political implications, and legal implications. I'd say around the social implications, one thing to realize is, the census has always been a difficult task. I mean, as the Census Bureau says, the goal of counting every person in the right place every 10 years is certainly no easy feat. And racial minority groups have often been part of the hard to reach population. In the last several years, what we've seen is that that task has been even more complicated by efforts from the federal government to chill or undercount that population by doing things like including a citizenship question on the census, and including a question like that in past studies and simulations has been shown to likely chill the participation of Latinos by 12% or 6 million people. That would be the number of people who would be left out if the question was included in the census. And were it not for litigation from groups like MALDEF and the Brennan Center, that question might still have been present on the census that is being administered right now. The one other thing I wanted to highlight, I've touched on a little bit, is I think an important legal challenge to thinking about immigrants as part of the total population base, or, in the terms of political theory, a piece of the political community. And that is the ongoing effort to change the denominator, the total population base, from being total population to a voter eligible population. And as I mentioned, that leaves out every category of immigrant, legal, and undocumented. It also leaves out felons. It also leaves out people who are under the age of 18. And the consequences of that have been estimated to include a loss of seats for states like Texas, Florida, California, places where there's a heavy representation of Asian Americans, Latinos, and immigrants. It likely would lead to the increase of seats for Alabama, Ohio, Minnesota, places in the Midwest, where you're not only losing population, but generally speaking, have a less diverse population than the United States.
Great. Professor Ellis, you've done a lot of thinking about how our political system is, as you call it, calcified in ways that help facilitate what you've described as minority tyranny. And I happen to think a lot about your remarks this morning, because just this morning at 2:24 a.m., Senator Mike Lee from Utah, no relation, tweeted that we aren't supposed to be a democracy, and in fact, in his view, that ranked democracy sometimes can thwart the true aims of the country. And yet, here we are at this point where we're becoming a much more diverse and much more complex, multiracial society, and then ideally a multiracial democracy. Can you talk a little bit about how this calcification in our political systems, in your view, undermines representation?
So, yeah, I can definitely do that. Let me join in the chorus of thanks to the Brennan Center and the Law Review and for putting together such a great symposium. I think that in particular, to answer your question, this calcification comes from the fact that we allow continued influence of the sort of patterns and practices which arguably, are embedded in our Constitution. I mean, that is a true fact. We can think of things like the Electoral College and think about how that amplifies power of states where looked at the basis of equal population would not have the same amount of power. And we can think about practices such as, the ability to use redistricting generally and the ability to gerrymander, in essence, to affect power in this sense, right? That representation, depending on a scheme that isn't about the whole number of citizens, so to speak, ends up being tilted towards one political interest or another. I think that this becomes a particular problem when we think about the representation of people of color, and that there are a number of patterns, whether it is about the structure of the political process or about intimidation and interference with the individual's right to vote, that amplify this. And part of this calcification issue, I think, is that these notions are, in essence, normalized in our political discourse. Talking about changing the Electoral College ends up getting treated as a fringe notion, and talking about that, I mean, states have started to make workarounds around these sorts of issues. Certainly the Interstate Compact that attempts to replicate a national popular vote result is slowly making its way through. But the fact of the matter is that these sorts of patterns and practices in regards to republicanism, not only the Electoral College, but the delegation of all power to run elections to the states, and thus allowing the states, at least the first instance, to qualify the weight and the qualifications for voting, all of these things help calcify. I think that there is a particular problem that I am afraid of in terms of minoritarian tyranny, if I could coin a phrase there. There is this long history, and this echoes the other panelists in their comments in terms of race-driven tactics, and particularly racial gerrymanders and voter suppression that directly target racial minorities in their particular jurisdictions. They get shut out of the process of being represented, and even if they are not literally shut out, I should say, because this is personal to me, we end up feeling like the system is not for us, and that there is this actual harm and this sort of representational harm that comes from feeling like we're not being represented. Of course, we can point to the law in terms of issues of racial gerrymandering, whether it be North Carolina, whether it be Alabama. We have seen legislatures use their power to shape districts in order to diminish and dilute the power of political representation. And certainly when it comes to crafting voter qualifications, North Carolina is a case study, right? We have seen redistricting schemes as well as their omnibus bill that the Fourth Circuit said targeted African Americans with, quote, almost surgical precision in terms of diminishing their ability to vote. And part of this problem, too, is that some of these things are getting aggravated within the COVID-19 context. And thinking about the opportunity to vote early being diminished, thinking about Texas and the controversy that has flared up around drop boxes for early votes being limited to one per county, and considering that majorly rural and large counties that are larger than the smallest of our states, as major urban areas like Houston, limited to one drop box. That seems to echo this theme that has already been stated in this panel in terms of suppressing the vote, and that it creates actual harm, very difficult measure, as well as the expressive harm of saying, particularly to communities of color, we don't belong to the democracy, that the democracy is not there for us. And some have even said so much is their intent, but all too often, these patterns, which are built upon the larger constitutional structure of allowing state deference, and to echo the points that were made earlier about voter fraud, that allowing state concerns about voter fraud more often than imagined than real. I have called, in my scholarship, I have called these things a meme, a picture that elicits a reaction, but not based on fact. And yet the actions elicited all too often work to create voter suppression. So the calcified deference leads to these patterns that the courts have tended more and more to defer to, and particularly and I've been speaking a lot about the sort of traditional African American South as an example of this. You know, the absence of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and this being the second major presidential election where we're seeing this absence being felt by the deference given to states, right? That the controls are off and the litigation becomes piecemeal rather than there being strong federal intervention in order to protect representation.
Thank you. Your remarks really sort of resonated with me about how all of these things sort of act to make people feel like they're not part of our political community. Because I have a friend who has an aunt who has been a U.S. citizen. She's an immigrant from Taiwan, but she has been a U.S. citizen for 38 years and has never, ever voted in an election until this year. And it just sort of like, and you can think, that she's not like a poor person, right? I mean, she's a person who could, but this in a lot of ways, hasn't, felt like her country, despite the fact that she has a U.S. passport as a U.S. citizen. And some of that is, of course, cultural, but some of it also is the way that we as a society sort of include people or don't include people. So speaking of elections, we're 26 days now away from an election. And while reform efforts in Congress and in many states have stymied because, there hasn't been the majority for that, that could change on November 3rd. And we could be at a, once in a generation or perhaps even a once in a multi-generation point where the canvas becomes ours again, and there is a chance to rework the legal framework governing a lot of these issues. If that were to happen, if you were to have sort of a reform-friendly majority in Congress or in state legislatures, what would be on your sort of dream list of things that you would do if you were president of the United States and able to move something? So let's start with President Sines.
Thank you, Michael. I think what we've seen in this extraordinary year as we prepare for the election, it's brought to more and more folks' public attention the tremendous difference in the right to vote depending on what state you reside in. And my hope is that in 2021, assuming the outcome that you've described, we'll begin to move toward a more uniform right to vote across the country, that Congress would aggressively use its constitutional authority to control federal elections to try to introduce greater uniformity. It really shouldn't depend on whether you're in California versus Texas or New York versus Alabama, what your right to vote consists of. We need to have greater and more uniform protection. And my hope is that we would see that, and it might be accentuated by the redistricting that will go on in 2021, where we'll see broadly differing approaches to redrawing lines, and that will catalyze an effort to get greater uniform protection of the right to vote nationwide. But my personal favorite is, I hope we will take this opportunity, if it comes to pass, to reintroduce one of the most successful civil rights provisions of our history, and one that I also have identified as perhaps the first and most successful alternative dispute resolution system in our federal laws, and that is to reinvigorate preclearance under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, that was a regime that subjected certain jurisdictions to having their election-related changes have to be pre-cleared by the Department of Justice, or alternatively a district court in Washington, D.C. And those states and other jurisdictions were identified based on a history of violating minorities' rights to vote. And that pre-clearance mechanism was really extraordinarily efficient, and not just for the plaintiffs who would otherwise be challenging these changes, but really for the jurisdictions that were making the changes and then would have to defend them. It was much more efficient and cost-effective to defend them in a pre-clearance regime than having to go to court on a Section 2 challenge. So I think we will have the opportunity to introduce greater uniformity in the right to vote by reinvigorating that pre-clearance regime with a new coverage formula. We've already had it introduced. We simply need to move forward and act on it. And the circumstance you've described, Michael, I hope will present that opportunity.
Thank you. Professor Ellis, Joe Biden is president and he says, I want you to be my democracy czar. What's on your list of things that we could do?
So first of all, I would join Thomas in saying that the very first bill, I would convene a conference call with the speaker and the majority leader of the Senate and say HR 1 needs to be a bill that, among other things, reinvigorates Section 5. And certainly, I would then even have conversations and think about, well, is there a way to conceptualize nationalizing the kind of section? Because I would want to do what's practical, but also imagine what could be possible, right? And just as a comment, I think that part of the calcification that I am railing against in my comments is that our imaginations are limited in terms of, what bill could pass, what would survive at the Supreme Court, and given the political realities of the latter, I can understand that. But, I think part of this conversation is about thinking about a generation from now, right? The often lauded 2040s decade where we become a country where we are a majority of minority groups put together, and sort of imagining what should the law be then. So starting these conversations about, well, what sort of expanded federal role? Maybe a Voting Rights Act that is about Section 5, but for the whole country, whether it be under the powers of the 14th Amendment or even the Elections Clause, right? Maybe a right to vote amendment in and of itself that specifies the sort of floor that states cannot go past in terms of the core political rights that everyone's guaranteed to be able to exercise. And in the broadest conceptual sense, and I think this panel gives us a sense that part of the challenge of the calcification of our political understanding is that a lot of our election laws have been shaped to combat Jim Crow and to combat the sort of theme of anti-Blackness in American society, right? That this is the civil rights struggle of the past. So broader conversations about what the civil rights struggles of the future ought to look like. We've already have been hinting at this, but I just want to make that explicit because it's important to build the foundations for that 2040 decade and beyond. That's what I would say to President Biden.
Like Joe Biden had become, Professor Jen, Joe Biden becomes president of the United States, but says, I don't want it anymore. Give it to Professor Chen, and you're now president. What are you doing?
I think we need to start by stopping the demolition. That is to say, to stem the tide of really hostile, really restrictionist policies that are harming Asian Americans, Latinos, and immigrants. And then I think after doing that, you can start to rebuild, right? To think about ways to actually expand the political community. And I think in terms of that demolition, for the groups that I study most closely, I think that it's important to immediately roll back some of the executive orders that have been issued that would try to circumvent the courts in adding a citizenship question to the census, in changing from a total population base to the citizen voting age population, despite precedents like Evanwell versus Abbott in the Supreme Court that have maintained that the constitutional commandment for representational equality can be based, and historically has been based, on a total population count. I think as well in the area of voting, my colleagues on the panel have talked already about the need to resuscitate and to restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. I would also pay some attention to Section 2, the voting dilution component of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, while that wasn't taken out by Shelby per se, it still has presented obstacles for the Asian American and Latino population over time. A lot of the formulas that are used to detect whether or not it's realistic for an Asian American or a Latino community to constitute a majority minority in a district have never worked well for the demographic attributes of Asian Americans and Latinos. Asian Americans tend to be politically more diverse. They don't always subscribe to the same political party. Geographically, they're often more diffuse than the African American population. And these kinds of issues were present before, but hopefully with a change in politics, you could start to actually get to those deeper structural reforms. And then the last thing I want to mention is sort of where I started in my remarks, is to reimagine the role of immigrants in our society. That is an increasing portion of the US population, and there is a claim for immigrants to be included in politics. I think so often we think about formal politics as excluding immigrants. But in fact, what we're seeing is that there's a pretty tight connection between the quest to shrink the representational equality for racial minorities and that for immigrants. And so I think connecting those two issues in order to understand how immigration enforcement policies might spill over into impeding an effective census count, or thinking about how it is that a focus on language barriers may help a population that is predominantly foreign-born. Those kinds of issues, I think, cut across communities over the trajectory of time.
Thank you. Thank you. Tom, I know that you had some additional thoughts about things that we might do if we were really being creative.
Well, I'm so pleased with the responses you've gotten. I would just say I would wholeheartedly endorse either Professor Ellis or Professor Chen being the voting rights czar under the Biden administration. I especially like that we're all in agreement that we need to reinvigorate pre-clearance. But I did want to mention that because Professor Ellis talked about nationalizing a notion of pre-clearance, and Professor Chen talked about adapting to these growing populations, new and growing populations, that we already have an element of that in what's been introduced in the House and passed in the House in the Voting Rights Advancement Act. And it's a new coverage formula to supplement the history-based formula that we've traditionally used. It's a new formula called known practices coverage that was specifically designed to address the concerns of emerging communities, recognizing that when you're a newly growing community that maybe hasn't been present in large numbers for a long time, you are not going to have the long history in that particular jurisdiction of suppressing your vote. It doesn't mean that they're not going to try to suppress your vote as you reach critical mass and threaten political power. So known practices coverage would apply pre-clearance across the country to any diverse jurisdiction where they're engaging in particular practices that we know from past experience to be used to deter and dilute minority votes. So for example, things like reverting to at-large elections from a districted system, or even things that we know happen all the time, like subjecting to pre-clearance review redistricting in the context of a decade where a particular minority community has grown a lot, a substantial amount, such that they are threatening incumbents, and incumbents can't be counted on to respect that growth instead of protecting their own political futures. But known practices coverage is an attempt to adapt, as you said in the beginning, a very powerful voting rights regime, but that was developed in a black-white context. But known practices coverage is an attempt to adapt it to a changing populace, to recognize we need to address concerns of newly growing populations that may not have decades-long histories in a particular jurisdiction and still subject known suspect practices to that very efficient pre-clearance practice.
Thank you. I think I'm going to nominate all three of you to be like co-czars for a new administration. So we're almost to the question, audience question portion of this, but I did want to give people briefly a moment to talk about we talked about the positive side, we could talk about the dark side as well, right? As Professor Ellis has written, history isn't linear. Let's talk about briefly what keeps you awake at night about what the next few years could hold, and what might be done. So maybe we could start with Professor Chen.
I think that one of the things that I worry about is this ongoing attempt, this very insidious, sometimes sneaky attempt to shrink the franchise and to shrink the definition of the political community. I have been talking a lot about the census because I do think it is in some ways the threshold before we even talk about voting rights, because it has such implications for the representatives that are elected to the House and how they end up being divided up so that they can or cannot cast a more effective vote on behalf of the population and constituency they represent. But in that domain, in the most recent congressional hearing about the census, which of course is currently ongoing, but we're still trying to figure out when it's going to wrap up and at what percentage point we'll consider it done. There was some testimony that really distressed me. And those were by comments from people like Chris Kobach or John Eastman, who talked about not only the desire to move from the citizen voting age population, but specifically to exclude immigrants and undocumented immigrants from that count. And I think that that is a dangerous misconception because it would exclude a population, not only from the political community, but then I think with spillover effects. For example, the distribution of public benefits that would then affect the economic standing of those groups, or in terms of the social inclusion, I think it feeds right into that anti-immigrant agenda that we see that leaves so many groups out. I think the one other thing I would mention is that my fear is that with this growing diversity, I hope that we could guard against any infighting. I think there are real opportunities here to build alliances between Latino, African American, and Asian American populations. The Black Lives Matters movement, I think, is showing evidence of that. But I think it will be important in order to move forward on an equality that includes everybody to find ways to advance common interests and not to advance certain reforms at the cost of others that could weaken historically disadvantaged groups.
Great. Professor Ellis, what keeps you awake at?
So I fear for Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, that the sort of trend towards critiquing particularly disparate impact analysis in federal statutory law generally, and of course that has sort of hung by a thread given what a very different court said just a few years ago in terms of maintaining disparate impact analysis that will be a very different court as soon as the confirmation process has concluded. They may turn and decide that the vote dilution theory under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional. That keeps me up at night, because I think that the varieties of discrimination that we worry about in the voting context in particular are about effects, and that the need for sort of express evidence regarding voting discrimination, i.e. statements of intent that either are directly racially discriminatory or, as we have seen in recent cases, draw the circumstantial inference that they're discriminatory. Those cases are difficult to prove. And certainly voting suppression is becoming more sophisticated. So the Section 2 tool being deactivated in a way similar to Section 5 makes me worry.
Great, thank you. And Tom, do you?
Having heard both of those answers, both of which I agree with, I'm not going to be getting much sleep since I'll be up thinking about all of these things. I do think 4 more years of a citizens first agenda could be really detrimental to our democratic principles, and I am concerned about what appears to be a planned assault on Section 2 through characterizing it as disparate impact, though I think totality of the circumstances, the test under Section 2 is really as close to an Arlington Heights analysis of what is racial intent as you can get. But I would say the one thing I would add to that is I am concerned that voter intimidation could become a regular part of political campaigns. We see it already and it's threatened. And if we don't, as a community, really push back very heavily, both through enforcement of laws against voter intimidation, in civil lawsuits challenging conspiracies of voter intimidation, and really public opinion against it, we will unfortunately see in the future that certain political interests will see it as part of their recipe for success, that they engage in concerted voter intimidation with armed and uniformed people at polls and the like. So I am very concerned about voter intimidation becoming more common in our political campaigns.
Thank you. That's certainly all stuff to not sleep about. So I've been told by our erstwhile programmers that I'm supposed to make an announcement at this point about those seeking CLE credit for this event. Please record the following code on your affirmation sheets in order to verify your attendance. The CLE code is K81 SBY. Again, the CLE code is K82 SBY. That's Kilo 81 Sierra Bravo Yankee. So, and with that, we've been getting lots of questions from the audience, and let's go through those and read a few. I'll throw out a couple, I think, at a time, and people can choose which one, if any, that they want to answer. One question that we had was about the size of the House, noting that we frequently expanded the size of the House over the course of the country's history, and yet we haven't done so since the 1920s now, and the country's obviously much larger than in the 1920s. Would increasing the size of the House help with more equitable representation? Related to that is the question of whether we should consider something other than a districted winner-take-all system. And then a final third question related to that deals with how do you deal with the fact that the Senate itself is very undemocratic, right? You know, in a few years, 80% of the population will have 20% of the Senate, or conversely, 20% of the population will control 80% of the Senate, right? And so that's just a few years away from where we are now. How do you deal with that? So feel free to answer any or all of those questions, and feel free to jump in. So.
Well, I'm happy to start, Michael. I think that clearly, if we were to expand the size of the House, it would present opportunities for smaller and growing communities to achieve representation in the House of Representatives. That, I think, it has to be balanced against workability of the body itself. And in theory, there is then an upper limit. I'm not sure we're there yet, so it's certainly something I would say we should consider, is whether that value of increasing representation for groups really requires us to push closer to that limit of workability for a deliberative body. As I said, I don't think we're there yet. I think the question about alternative systems is one that comes up frequently, but until we address the very serious issues of differentials of participation between communities, I think that that's not yet a reform that we can implement without expecting to continue, replicate, and in some ways even exacerbate the existing problems of minority representation in our legislative bodies. Because years and years and years of voter suppression, the creation of systems that result in candidates favored by minority communities never getting elected, we have enduring turnout and participation differentials. And until we invest in solving those, then alternative systems aren't going to solve the problem of making sure that everyone is represented, has their vote counted equally.
Thank you. Professor Chen or Professor Ellis?
If I could take out this question about expanding the franchise to younger voters and legal residents and the prison population, I think that's a great question because that really goes to the structure of democracy, right? Not just a question of how do you get different results, but how do you actually make the rules of the game more fair and more equitable? And I'll share an example. I'm calling in from Colorado. And we have a state initiative on the ballot to amend the Constitution to clarify that the right to vote is limited to a voter-eligible population. Now, when you think about who that leaves out, I think obviously it leaves out non-citizens, although it is already the case that non-citizens are ineligible to vote in federal elections and in state elections in Colorado. But it also leaves out individuals who are under the age of 18. For state elections in Colorado, those who are 17 years old have been allowed to vote, and this would change that population. And I think that it's important to realize when we talk about leaving out young people, it's not just that we're leaving out the future generations and they'll get there eventually. We're leaving out a generation that is more diverse, that is more ideologically progressive. And so leaving out those young people will have consequences for the types of issues that can make it onto the political agenda and eventually through Congress to actually become law. I think with felon disenfranchisement, that's something that I know the Brennan Center has been really active on. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I think Janae Nelson spoke last week. She was actually my first supervisor in my first summer of law school at LDF before she was a professor. And I know that, with that population, a lot of the gains are being won in the courts. But ultimately, the kinds of changes I'm talking about for the felon population, as well as for young people and undocumented immigrants, that's going to require a political change. I think the courts have to be part of that, but it's going to require a political change and an uprising and a mobilization of groups that have not traditionally been very engaged in politics. And I think that will require getting people excited about the candidates we have and making people hopeful about the possibility that their voice actually does count.
If I could just pick up on that theme in two regards, and it also dovetails to a question that I think is lingering out there too, in terms of making how to convince people of color that their votes matter. I think that this representation issue in part feeds on seeing representation that folks can, to coin a pun, believe in, which is a callback to this sort of levels of participation from the African American community, at least during the Obama campaigns, right? And that I think there was in addition to minority participation, I think that there were just gains across the board in terms of the willingness to participate that came from the communities that fell off in the past election, and we will see what will happen with the election to come. And without taking a partisan stand, because that is not our calling here, I think that what is clear is that the first message to create is that elections do matter, and that elections have consequences, and that those consequences can be positive and negative. And this dovetails with the other point about felon disenfranchisement, I think. Just thinking about the Florida narrative in particular, that on the one hand, there was that sort of political uprising through the referendum process that passed Amendment 4. And for those of you who might not be familiar, Amendment 4 abolished the permanent ban on ex-felon voting in the Florida Constitution. And so this was seen as a big gain. But of course, to the point about elections having consequences, the legislature in place almost immediately followed that amendment by reinterpreting the definition of completion of sentence. So the amendment basically said all persons who have completed their sentence will be eligible to register and vote. But then the legislature redefined completion of sentence to include payment of all fees and fines. And with the ongoing litigation there, which I think for purposes of the 2020 election at least, has been definitively decided, where the 11th Circuit en banc decided that that was constitutional, we saw the good work undone. This tells the story of the calcification and the story of the difficulties of attaining wins, but that at the end of the day, the political choice in order to react to that is the next chapter to be written. And that's why elections matter.
Thank you. Let's go through. Another question that we had was about what 6-3 conservative Supreme Court potentially foretends about voting and fair representation in our country. It seems like people aren't being very optimistic about Justice Merrick Garland, but oh wait. Anyway, so if people want to talk about the courts and where the courts fit in, I'll reframe the question a little bit. I mean, how to be, about a 6-3 conservative court, or about where the courts fit in more broadly in the fight for fair representation.
Well, I think it's quite clear that the Supreme Court is critical, that federal courts in general are critical, so that if there is a new administration, we've got to have that administration move with alacrity to fill all of the vacancies as they come up, from district court through the Court of Appeals. I think that what the Supreme Court does, particularly with respect to issues of democracy and voting, may well dictate whether there is a serious consideration about expanding the size of the Supreme Court. I think a successful attempt to confirm a justice at this late point in an election year may of itself precipitate serious consideration of expanding the size of the court. But as in the Roosevelt era, the decisions that come out, and particularly those that are viewed as most threatening to democracy, are the ones that will trigger greater consideration of an expansion of the court. So I would think that voting rights would be an area that Chief Justice Roberts, with his high concern about institutional integrity and institutional survival, would pay close attention to. But 6-3, one justice isn't going to make a difference. So I think it's a good question.
Could point out, in terms of the courts generally, let me give a shout out to state courts, right? State Supreme Courts matter in this battle too. Where the Constitution where the federal Constitution has no affirmative statement regarding the right to vote, and all of the amendments are framed in the negative, not discriminate on race or gender or age above 18 years old. Every state constitution has some sort of affirmative statement regarding the right to vote. And for example, in the voter ID battles, some of the best wins have been state Supreme Court wins. So I think state Supreme Courts have a role to play too in terms of fostering better and a more representative democracy.
Professor Chin, I'm going to let you have the last word.
Wow, that seems like a big responsibility. I think I'll circle back to a theme that's come out of this panel, which is that democracy matters. If anything, I think the limitations that may come of from the courts, whether because the balance is 6-3 or because they're hampered by case law that constrains their ability to open up political equality. I think that all of those mean that, again, we need to come back to empowering the electorate to be able to speak back about what they care about, who they want to elect to Congress, and then holding those elected officials accountable to a broad range of interests, and not just the ones that have carried the day so far under a much more constrained environment than I hope would exist going forward.
And with that, I'm going to close out our panel. Our thanks to Professor Ellis, Professor Chen, and to Tom Sines for this enlightening discussion. We are also grateful to the partnership with NYU Law Review, the John Brademas Center, and NYU Votes, their collaboration on this program. I'm Michael Lee. If you have any questions about your CLE credits or codes, please let us know. And with that, I'm going to turn it back.
Thank you for attending Panel 1 of today's Voting and Representation Symposium, presented by the Brennan Center for Justice and New York University Law Review. We will return for Panel 2, Building a More Inclusive Democracy, at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, in just under 10 minutes. Good afternoon. We will begin panel 2 of today's Voting and Representation Symposium in just a few minutes. Thank you. Today's second panel, Building a More Inclusive Democracy, will now begin. We are happy to introduce your moderator, Nicholas Stephanopoulos, a professor of law at Harvard Law School.
What are the obstacles that continue to undermine our democracy? We'll discuss what can be done to address these barriers, our existing constitutional system, and we'll propose ideas for how to broaden the scope of who our government serves. We are grateful to be producing today's events with the NYU Law Review, NYU's John Brademas Center, and NYU Votes. And as this is an election year, I want to take a moment to clarify that the Brennan Center for Justice is a nonpartisan 501c3 and does not participate in elections or endorse or oppose candidates. And now it is my pleasure to introduce your panelists. Wilfred Codrington III is professor of law at Brooklyn Law School and a fellow at the Brennan Center. Lee Drutman is a senior fellow in the political program at New America. Chara Torres-Spelleski is a professor of law at Stetson University College of Law and a fellow at the Brennan Center. And Cristina Sinsun Ramirez is the founder and chief strategy officer of JOLT. We're so excited to have a big virtual audience today, and we would love to get some questions from all of you. You can tweet questions using the hashtag BrennanLive, or if you're watching on the YouTube or Facebook stream, go ahead and leave us a comment with questions. We'll take as many as we can during the program. And for those seeking CLE credit for this event, we will flash 3 to 5 unique codes on the bottom of the screen. So make sure you use the link to the attorney affirmation form in the description box. Contact information if you have any questions about credit. Great. So with those logistical points out of the way, let's turn to the substance of this panel. And let's start by laying out some of the challenges that our democracy faces today. And this is a question for all of our panelists, and we'll go through them in the order they were introduced. What do each of you see as the biggest problems that face contemporary American democracy? And so Wilfred, why don't you lead off?
Sure. Thank you, Nick, and thank you to the Brennan Center and NYU Law Review for everything to put this important and timely discussion together. I guess, stated simply, what I think the biggest problem is for democracy is that we are increasingly governed by a minority. This happens because of structural problems we have in the Constitution that are aggrandized by legislation and other sort of policies. So what do I mean? The Senate, as we know, is extremely unrepresentative of the United States in general. Each state obviously gets 2 senators, and that is irrespective of their actual population. So you have a state that is the size of Wisconsin with under 700,000 people having equal power to California. The Electoral College is extremely unrepresentative of the country in a number of ways, but most notably, the way that it plays out recently is that it's produced the wrong winner. That is, that the popular vote has chosen someone on multiple occasions, and the Electoral College has awarded the presidency to another. And then in the way that the Supreme Court and our judiciary is sort of structured and ultimately stacked, and that is due to a number of things, including lifetime tenure, but also because the disproportionate skew of both the Senate and the presidency, which are required to appoint lifetime judges. So those are what I think are the 3 sort of big problems in terms of unrepresentativeness of American democracy.
Great, thank you, Wilfred. Lee, do you want to jump in?
And thank you, Nick. And thank you to NYU for putting together this fabulous panel with so many brilliant people. You know, America is transitioning to becoming a multi-ethnic democracy, or really we are a multi-ethnic democracy. And it's a challenge to have a multi-ethnic democracy. And this is something that political scientists have thought about and have really you know, tried to think of ways, if you were going to set up a political system that was going to be a successful multi-ethnic democracy, what are the things to do and what are the things to avoid? Now, one of the things that almost any comparative political scientist will tell you that you want to avoid is you want to avoid majoritarian winner-take-all type systems that concentrate power in a very narrow number of hands, and particularly a strong executive and you really want to avoid a two-party system. Because what happens in a two-party system, particularly one in which the fundamental conflict becomes a structure over race and ethnicity and national identity, as it has become now, is you get exactly what we are suffering from now, which is this kind of intense emotional hyperpartisanship, which is just fundamentally antithetical to the idea of a diverse democracy. And it really doesn't work with our political institutions, which are in fact designed to foster broad compromise. And it also doesn't work with our minds, which are very prone to us versus them thinking, binary thinking as it is, and to have a political system that really amplifies and turbocharges those destructive elements in our psychology is very dangerous. So to me, the fundamental problem is that we have a two-party system that is creating this escalating polarization, what I've called the two-party doom loop, and that's not good for anybody. And I think it's particularly dangerous for minority representation because in such a system, there's a tendency towards authoritarianism as things break down, and that we know where that goes. So fundamentally, I think we have to change how we vote in this country. We have to become a more proportional democracy to allow more diversity of views. Any comparative political scientist will tell you that a proportional voting system is much fairer to minority representation because it means that you don't have to be in a majority minority district in order to elect your candidate of choice, which doesn't really work well for everybody and also comes at a high cost for a lot of reasons that we can go into in more detail. But bottom line, I think the way that our two-party system has developed, where it is now, is the fundamental threat to American democracy writ large, and also to building an inclusive, fair democracy, which you can't have if you don't have a functional democracy at all.
Thank you, Lee. And before Chara jumps in, for those of you who are seeking CLE credit for this event, please record the following code on your affirmation sheets in order to verify your attendance. Code number 2, it is RO7ZIL. Again, CLE code number 2 is RO7ZIL. Romeo Oscar 7 Zulu India Lima. And Chara, over to you.
Sure. So after I wrote my latest book, which is Political Brands, I would say that one of the biggest threats to our democracy is the way that each of us has placed ourselves in an information silo. And then that interacts with our campaign finance system. So most money that is spent in our elections is spent on advertising. And more of that advertising is going digital. And one of the big differences between spending your money on broadcast ads and spending your money on micro-targeted ads is there is this increased ability to lie directly to a particular voter. And based on what you know about that voter, which is usually found in the political file, which includes everything from your name and address, age, whether you've been divorced, whether you own guns, all sorts of personal information, including your web browsing history. And based on all of that, it is way easier for political spenders to target persuasive advertising directly at you in your social media feed. And what that leads to is the potentiality of lying in a different and tailored way to each individual voter. Now, of course, we've always had some version of this. Like, you could have lied in a broadcast ad, but with a broadcast ad, the politician is likely to be called on it by the media or by their political opponent. But if the targeted ad is just, slightly different from a different ad that your neighbor sees, it's going to be very difficult for the media to pick up on all of those subtleties and all of the different ways that a politician can spin their message just to appeal to you and just to get your vote. So what I am most worried about is the social media environment that we have put ourselves in, where we like our confirmation biases, we like seeing things that confirm what we already believed, and politicians can slip right into that. They can target us with persuasive messages that are not the same messages that they're giving to even our spouse or someone across the street. And I worry that we are losing a shared sense of what is even true. Thank you.
Thanks, Chara. And Christina, let me turn the mic over to you.
Yeah, for me, there's an overall lack of commitment to democracy itself in this country. Today, we had Mike Lee, Senator of Utah, holding one of the highest elected offices in the country, tweet that democracy is not the objective, that liberty, peace, and prosperity are, yet with no acknowledgement that democracy is the force that makes that possible. I think we have to remember that democracy is perhaps one of the most powerful tools to foment change. And because it is so powerful, because it is the great equalizer, that powerful interests have always sought to undermine it and limit its reach. And democracy doesn't die in one fall swoop. It dies with 1,000 cuts. It dies with undercounting immigrants and their children in the census. It dies when we allow for former felons and current felons to not have the right to vote. It dies when we allow outside money to play such a huge influence. We have to center always expanding the franchise and making it easy and efficient for every single eligible American to vote. That is no longer our guiding principle. And there are many times in our country that hasn't been the guiding principle. But I think it has reached a fever pitch where even someone like Senator Mike Lee can post that on Twitter and start to move the needle on what people are willing to accept from their elected leaders. No longer wanting to serve in the interests, even saying so to serve in the interests of the American people.
Thanks a lot, Christina. I want to turn next to some of the areas where each of our panelists has particular expertise. Wilfred, let me start with you. You mentioned the Electoral College before, which of course is our unique mechanism for selecting the president. What sorts of reforms would you favor for the Electoral College, and through which mechanisms? Constitutional amendment, an interstate compact, or something else that I haven't mentioned?
Sure, yeah. So it's interesting because the Gallup poll just put out a recent poll, again, showing that 60+% of Americans are for getting rid of the Electoral College. And this is not an outlier. In history, this has been the case. And it's only recently that Americans have been so split on getting rid of the Electoral College, because they know it undermines the fundamental values of democracy and the idea that one person's vote anywhere should be equal to one person's vote elsewhere. Getting rid of the Electoral College itself is a challenge because it requires amending the Constitution, which requires you to get supermajorities in both Congress and the states to sign off on this. And we were very close to this in the 1969, 1970s. Again, you had 80% of Americans supporting it then. We were very close to this. The House had passed the measure overwhelmingly. And then there was a blockade of Southern segregationists led by Strom Thurmond that filibustered the measure, and it died. So we were very close. People are typically in agreement that the Electoral College is no way to select the president because it induces the president to tether and govern towards a few people as opposed to the majority of people in the country. You mentioned the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and I think that is a good at least temporary resolution to this problem. And the idea behind the National Popular Vote Compact is that since state legislators get to choose how they allocate their state's electoral votes, they would, instead of allocating them to the winner of the popular vote of their state, which every state does to some extent or another, there are two that sort of do it by the congressional district method. But instead of giving it to the winner, the presidential candidate winning the popular vote in their state, they would award them to whoever wins the national popular vote. And the compact will not go into effect until you get 270 states and the District of Columbia worth of electoral votes signed up for this, because obviously it would be sort of mutually or disarming yourself if you were to give your electoral votes before everybody else was sort of signed on. And so right now that has a number of states, and the District of Columbia signed on. I believe it's 16 at this point, and then the District of Columbia, that's 196 electoral votes. So we are 70 some odd votes, 74 votes away from that actually being able to take effect. So I think that is advisable at this point, and I think it is the temporary solution before we can get to an actual constitutional amendment.
Great, thanks, Wilfred. Lee, beforehand, you mentioned some alternatives to the usual American winner-take-all elections. There are lots of these alternative voting systems that are out there. And so I'm curious which one is your preferred system and why, and also what you see as the most realistic way to achieve such fundamental reform of the American electoral system.
Sure, yeah, you're right. There are certainly a lot of types of proportional representation. The system that I prefer is a system that's in use in Ireland, which is ranked choice voting with multi-member districts. Ranked choice voting is something that's caught on quite a bit. It's where candidates rank their choices, and then the choices get eliminated from the bottom up. And that ensures that more voters can select their candidate of choice. I particularly like the multi-winner form of it, which would create, say, 5-member districts, and that's a way to have a proportional representation. Again, it's used in Ireland. It's also used in Northern Ireland, by the way, and it was seen as a way to reduce some of the tensions that had caused so much violence in Northern Ireland, and it's largely been seen as successful in that respect. I like the ranked choice voting aspect of things because it particularly it encourages cross-cutting coalitions. This is often recommended in particularly divided societies, ethnically divided societies, because it encourages people to seek support from other people outside of their group in this voting method. So they might not be their first choice, but they might be their second or third choice. And again, I prefer a proportional system that allows more parties, because I think it is much fairer to everyone, really, to have a broader range of options and not shoehorn everybody into a two-party system. Also, it solves the problem of minority representation, because it means that minorities don't have to be segregated into single-member districts that are majority-minority districts in order to elect their candidates of choice, which doesn't really work well for a lot of different minorities. It's historically worked pretty well for African Americans, although as African Americans move out to the suburbs, less, that works less well. Latinos, certainly it has not worked well. Asians, it's worked terribly for, because of the lack of concentration in single districts. How could this happen? It could happen in a number of ways. The most straightforward way would be for Congress to use its Article 1, Section 4 power to change how we vote, and it could pass. There's in fact a bill now, the Fair Representation Act, which does this for the House. I'd also like to pair that with increasing the size of the House, which I think would also make our democracy more inclusive and fair and representative by bringing more voices in, and also getting rid of primary elections. But I think the main thing is to move to a more proportional system. I think sometimes people say, "Oh, that's a kind of radical change," but in many respects, the radical change in American politics is that we've become this fully sorted two-party system, which has only happened somewhat recently. And I would argue that in many ways, America operated much more like a multi-party system for most of our history, and actually that's much more closely in line with what Madison's vision of a pluralistic republic ought to be. And I also want to speak directly to some of the issues that have been raised by my fellow panelists, in terms of minority rule, as Wilfred mentioned, or voter suppression, as Christina mentioned, which I think really flow out of the way that our two-party system is operating right now in terms of minority rule. Minority rule can really only operate in actually, quite ironically, in a majoritarian system in which you can be a plurality of the electorate, but because of the way that seats to vote translation works with single member district, you can create tremendous disproportionality that allows minorities to rule. I mean, then there's the issue of the Senate, which is a whole other problem. But it's very difficult for a minority to rule in a proportional system because you actually have to build a majority coalition in order to govern. To Christina's point, which is a point raised in the previous panel of voter suppression, in a two-party system, any voters who would support the other party, if you can get them not to vote, then your party is going to gain. But in a multi-party system, it's not clear that your side is going to gain if you suppress the votes. In fact, voter suppression is really, you don't see it in proportional Western European democracies. It's only a function of our system, particularly with single-member districts, in which there's a handful of swing districts, and everything is super close. So there's a strong incentive to engage in this voter suppression, which you've seen increasing over the last 20 years as the election has become closer, as the hyperpartisanship has increased. And to Char's point about epistemological information bubbles, which is a serious and quite dangerous thing that's happening, in that we have two separate realities. Again, that is fundamentally a feature of a binary political system in which there's so much confirmation bias and people are willing to believe lies about how evil the other side is, because everything has become so hyper-partisan. And what's interesting is actually that somebody did a study of Twitter following networks across different democracies. And in majoritarian democracies like the US and the UK, the networks were extremely different, that there was very little overlap. But in proportional systems, there was much more overlap among Twitter following networks of different parties. And so the internet penetration and the ability to micro-target through social media and whatnot has increased throughout Western democracies, but something is different about the US and to some extent the UK that has turned this into a problem of hyperpartisanship. And I really think it's our majoritarian winner-take-all two-party system.
Thanks a lot, Lee. Char, let me turn to you. You mentioned before your terrific new book on political brands. As you point out in the book, branding can be both positive and also pernicious. Candidates and parties can brand things like racism and xenophobia and the like. So what can be done about this kind of malevolent political branding, either legally or through political action?
Yeah, so one of the things that I discovered in writing this book is basically almost anything can be pathologized and almost anything can be normalized. And one of the concepts that's up for grabs in our politics right now is, what does racism mean? For some people, they have a very narrow vision of what counts as racist. So for the people who have this really narrow conception, you basically need to be a KKK member in white robes in front of a burning cross before they will acknowledge that that person is racist. Now, on the other extreme, you have our cognitive scientists who tell us that all of us have implicit bias against outgroups, including racial outgroups. Well, if you have someone who has the narrow conception of racism talking to someone who has this incredibly broad conception of racism, they're likely to talk right past each other because they're literally not talking about the same thing. One is talking about conscious bias, and the other is talking about unconscious bias. Given that racism is up for grabs, it's one of these things that politicians will deploy in very specific ways, and they will give it the meaning that is most advantageous to them. But one of the things that I explore in the book is which political party in any given period gets the racially motivated white voters who are voting in part because of their racial discrimination. And, you know, if you look at the post-Civil War period up until the mid-20th century, I think the winner for who gets the most racially motivated voters is definitely the Democratic Party. And part of the way we know that is the Democratic Party tried to constitutionalize their racism. They literally went to court to defend the ability to keep Black voters out of their primaries. And to the Supreme Court's credit, the court, in cases that are still controversial because of the state action doctrine, they find that the political parties in their primaries have sufficient state action that the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment apply. So that is one approach to deal with racism in political parties. Recognize that there is state action, and thus the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and the 15th Amendment's Clause 1 apply, and thus you can't use a political party to racially discriminate. And I think that's sort of an interesting question in the present day, because right now the court is much more likely to treat a political party as a private group. And as a private group, the court has essentially treated our two main political parties as if they were country clubs. And a country club, under the First Amendment and freedom of association, has the ability to not associate with particular voters, which is a line of cases which runs completely contrary to the white primary cases, which I referenced earlier. And so I think one of the new frontiers that the law is going to have to deal with are things like what an expose by Channel 4 just showed about what the Trump campaign was doing in 2016. And what that expose showed is that they had lists of African-American voters on a roster that called for, quote, deterrence. So the African-American voters who were targeted for deterrence were given targeted messages to stop them from voting or to discourage them from voting. And I think one of the most heartbreaking things, and I would encourage all of the viewers today to look at what Channel 4 found in these documents, is they went to specific African-American voters who were on that list, and they told them, look, you were targeted in this way. And the reaction of one of the African-American women voters was, oh my gosh, I've got to vote in the 2020 election. So it can be empowering to know what people are up to, like how they are trying to manipulate you. The more it is covert, the less likely people are going to find out in time, like in real time, where they can really do something. But I think there's also a challenge for our courts. If they're going to treat political parties like they are country clubs, then we have a problem, because then it's not a problem that a political candidate is targeting voters in a racial way with voter suppression messages. So I think that we're going to have to return to the wisdom of the white primary cases, find some state action, and actually hold political actors accountable for doing these pernicious things.
Thanks a lot, Chara. Christina, you're our one panelist who's not ensconced in the ivory tower, and you're also the founder of JOLT, Texas's largest Latino voter group. So I'm curious, what kinds of electoral reforms do you think are most important for Latino voters? And more generally, as somebody who's not an academic, do you think the reforms that academics often talk about have appeal to activists like you on the ground?
So, you know, here in Texas, we are just one of the few states in the country that are majority minority. 40% of our population is Latino. We have the largest Black population of any state. And so when we talk about the attacks on the right to vote and democracy, a lot of that comes home for us here in Texas for communities of color. And speaking to what Lee and Chara spoke about and the other panelists is, you know, in the United States, we have consistently used criminality and illegality to try and paint communities of color as to block them from having the right to vote. And I see that happening a lot here in Texas. At my organization, JOLT, we organize young Latino voters. We talk about, for example, that immigration is really just a cover for talking about race and voting power. That here in Texas, 1 in 3 of us are immigrants or children of immigrants. It's even higher for the Latino population. Half of us are children of immigrants in the state. And that we know that the people in power are not just afraid of our immigrant parents. They're not just afraid of my 62-year-old immigrant Mexican mother, but they are deeply afraid of me, her US citizen daughter that can vote and has a radically different vision for my country than the one I see today. So I think for us, we talk about the values. I think there are so many ways that we are talking about how we uplift one person, one vote, how we actually create parties that are representative of the American people. And for me, it goes back to the value set, because we have to remember that it was also Democrats that wanted to block former felons from having the right to vote in many states across this country that predominantly focused on the African-American community. And today, the discussion around immigration here in Texas, just in 2018, our government tried to purge 100,000 naturalized citizens from voting that were eligible and had the right to vote and threatened to prosecute them. Of course, it was found out to all be a big, tall Texas tale because they were naturalized citizens that had the right to vote. But I think for us, what's important is to talk about the value set that we're working towards, because there's so many different ways we can strengthen our democracy. But for it to translate on the grassroots level, I think that if we can just go with some clear values, one, that we need to make it easy and efficient as possible for every single American to vote. So that gives us the opportunity, if we are leading with that value set, to have automatic voter registration. It allows us to talk about the fact that Election Day should be a national federal holiday. It allows us to talk about that, yes, you should be allowed to vote by mail because it makes it easier for you to vote and expands the franchise. The other one I think that's important, especially with the targeting of communities of color and trying to block them from voting, I think that we will see immigration continue to be a foil for trying to block communities of color from voting and their citizen children, if they are not naturalized citizens themselves, is that if you are an American and you are born with the right to vote, you should die with the right to vote. No one should ever be able to take away your right to vote. And lastly, I think, especially for the community that I come from, that is one of the poorest communities in the country, is that we have to get money out of politics. And I'm not just talking about dark money. We need to come to a place where we have publicly financed elections. Who gets to serve, whose voice gets to be heard, shouldn't be determined by how many rich people you know, but should be determined by the merit of your ideas.
Great, thank you, Christina. Let me now pose a question to all of our panelists, which you can chime in on as you see fit. Imagine that it's now early 2021 and that a unified Democratic government in Washington is considering passing an electoral reform bill. What's one policy you'd want to see in that bill? And what's one common proposal that you wouldn't want to include in legislation? And I think all of you have relevant views on this, so I'm not going to call on one person to start. But if one person wants to jump in, please feel free.
I'm muted, sorry. I'm happy to jump in. I'll have to think about the second one. One thing I'd love to see right up front would be statehood for the District of Columbia. Quite frankly, the problem with the District of Columbia is as old as the country itself, and simply stated, you have 700,000 Americans living in the nation's capital, and that nation's capital treats them like it is the last colony on the soil of the United States. So why do I think this? I think that what we have is a lack of reciprocity. We have Washingtonians making contributions towards this country that are outsized in proportion to who they are and where they are. They pay federal taxes that are per capita larger than any state. They serve in the military. They're governed by the laws of the United States and possess all the duties of Americans who live here as citizens, and yet they lack full voting representation in the House of Representatives, and they have no representation in the Senate. So there's no reciprocity because they're not given the benefits afforded to American citizens. And this is an outlier. There is no other democratic nation where the residents of the nation's capital are excluded from the legislature. And really, I think what we have are arguments against District of Columbia are sort of knee-jerk and gut reaction arguments against it. And they say some have to do with the Constitution and some have to do with our democratic values, but I think none of those are really apt. And frankly, what I think this is pure politics. To this end, I think nothing has really changed in the 1970s when the District of Columbia was on the cusp of actually being more fully embraced into the United States as a political community. And frankly, then the late Senator Ted Kennedy said it has to do with the 4 twos. The District of Columbia is too urban, too black, too democratic, and too liberal. And frankly, not much of this has changed. The district is nearly 50% black, although that is waning, but the rest of those stand. And I think really given all of the contributions that Washingtonians have made, and given the way that they've been ostracized from the American political community since effectively day one, it is about time to regard them as full members of the American society.
Thanks, Wilfred. Other panelists who want to jump in on my question, and you don't have to, if not, we can certainly move on to audience questions as well.
Sure. Let me just add in, which is the ultimate dodge to your question, but to just invoke HR 1. So HR 1 was the Democratic package of nearly every reform one could ever want in the area of democracy. It has campaign finance reforms. It has voter right reforms. It deals with foreign interference in our elections. And so one of the things that will be very interesting if there actually is unified rule come January is what parts of HR 1 get dusted off and actually put forward as serious legislation, and which are just going to be politically unfeasible. I mean, part of HR 1 is giving DC statehood. So we'll see what the fight looks like in January. We might actually have that fight in real time for once.
Great. Thanks, Chara. I think we should move on to some audience questions now. Lee, jump in, Lee.
Can I just, unless Christina wants to say something here too. Yeah, so absolutely, HR 1, I love it. You know, it's got serious campaign finance reform, public funding. It makes it a lot easier to vote. Absolutely, it shouldn't be a challenge to vote. I mean, most democracies have some form of automatic voter registration. That's a basic thing. As a DC resident, I would, absolutely DC statehood. I want to have a vote. But here's the thing that I think we all need to think about is that, our democracy is in a very fragile state right now because we are losing a shared sense of fairness and legitimacy to our institutions. And we know how democracies die. We know how democracies crumble. They crumble when you have this incredibly high stakes binary polarization that's a fight over who we are and what our national identity is. This is incredibly destructive. And, I'm all for, Democrats making it fair to vote. I mean, I feel like the patient is on life support and we've got to get, which is our democracy, we've got to get that patient breathing again. But we also have to do more. I think we've got to make our democracy more broadly fair and representative. That goes beyond HR 1, and we've got to make it feel legitimate to everyone. Because, democracy, self-governance is not something that we can take for granted. We all have to have a sense that the system is legitimate, and that includes Republicans too. If Democrats do this big thing, HR 1 and DC state impact the courts, right? What are Republicans going to do in response? Roll over or come back, hit back harder, more aggressive, and we'll be further down the slide to Democratic destruction. So we need to think more broadly about how we make our democracy sustainable. Now, I believe the way to do that is to fundamentally change how we vote, have a more proportional democracy. It will be easier for minorities to be represented in proportion to their voting power. We won't have key swing states that decide the election. We won't have key swing voters who happen to be, downscale whites who just are well placed in certain Rust Belt states who get to decide where the parties are going. And it means that everybody's vote will count regardless of where they live, which is incredibly important. Right now, urban voters are concentrated in lopsided districts where their vote doesn't matter. And that is tremendously unfair. We have a system that allows for minority rule because of the way that votes get translated into seats. And we have this escalating hyper-partisanship that's boiling over into hatred, and to the point where people are willing to see their side trample on basic democratic norms if it means that their side can maintain power, because there's this sense that if the other side gains power, somehow they're going to run the entire table. And we talk about Christina, you talk about the fear that a lot of people feel of people like you getting into power. And I think part of that fear is that if Democrats get the majority, they will use their power to shut down everything that white Christian America stands for. And that is certainly overblown. But there is a sense in our majoritarian system that if one party gains power, they will use it to oppress minorities, because that's what majorities have done throughout the history of the United States.
Thanks a lot, Lee. We've got to move on to questions from the audience. And Christina, let me start with you. So Texas, your state, has been at the forefront of racial gerrymandering and voter suppression in recent years. What options are there to restore anything like pre-clearance for Texas, which of course was the regime that applied to Texas and other southern states under the Voting Rights Act, up until the Supreme Court invalidated that portion of the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby County decision?
Yeah, I think that, we've talked a lot about things we would like to see passed in Congress, but we haven't really talked a lot about Supreme Court strategy and longer term, some of the erosion that we've seen with the Voting Rights Act being key. Also the influence of money in politics, which also requires legal strategy. In Texas, we are set to have 3 new congressional seats if we actually get counted. I think 10 years ago, no one could have imagined the census being weaponized in the way it has been in 2020. In Texas, we will have redistricting coming up. And I do think that this speaks to Lee's challenge of a 2-party system, that clearly we want fair lines and people that are committed to that. But when you have a 2-party system, it makes it challenging for fair districts to be fully drawn, especially in a place like Texas, where we have some of the largest urban centers in the state. We have a district right now in Texas that goes all the way from San Antonio to El Paso, a congressional district. Those are lines that were drawn up to favor Republicans back in 2003 here in our state. And so there are great initiatives that folks like the Brennan Center have talked about and the ACLU has talked about, MALDEF has talked about. But I think that even with the proposals we have before us, I think the biggest challenge we do face is actually our two-party system to creating fair districts, even by using some of the systems around, trying to draw out fair lines based through computer systems instead of leaving it in the hands of individuals. I think that will be our greatest challenge to addressing gerrymandering long term.
Great, thank you, Christina. This is a question for Wilfred, although you can all jump in after Wilfred answers. Wouldn't it restore balance to stack the courts in response to the courts being stacked for years? And I assume there's a partisan balance to this question. Wouldn't it restore balance for Democrats to stack the courts in response to the courts being stacked by Republicans for years?
Yeah, I mean, I don't love the discussion about stacking anything because you stack a deck when you want to be unfair. What we need to be talking about when we're talking about the courts, first of all, we know that the majority of the justices on this court now, the majority will be appointed by someone who did not have the popular support of the people. So we do need to think about that from that perspective. We might want to think about whether the Supreme Court itself is capable of handling the sort of docket that would be useful and helpful for American democracy. It's hearing less cases than it's heard in nearly a century at this point. It's hearing 80 cases a year when they used to hear double that number of cases. So is the Supreme Court bogged down? And if so, is that a reason why you might want to expand that court? Other things that I'm worried about the courts themselves are the courts are just, there's some backsliding in terms of not just the ideology, but the diversity in the courts themselves. So this panel is called Building a More Inclusive Democracy, and a core part of that is making sure that our judiciary reflects our diverse society, and increasingly it does not. It does not. Not only are we getting candidates or nominees who are comparing campus affinity groups to white Aryan student unions and speaking about feel-good ethnic hoedowns at Stanford, my alma mater. I've never been to a feel-good ethnic hoedown, but that's what nominees are spouting. But beyond that, we're also getting it not looking like America. So you see that President Trump has appointed about 15% of his judges are people of color, whereas under President Obama, it was 36. And even George Bush, it was 18%. It was higher than it was at this point. Even Jimmy Carter, we can go back to that. It was 21% of his, and that was in the 1970s. So, there's not the pipeline problem that we've had or the lack of access to the legal profession that we had. And same thing for women on the bench. This president has only appointed 25% or maybe less than that to the bench, whereas Obama was appointing nearly 50%. So I think what we really first need to be thinking about is to make sure that our judiciary looks like America, and then thinking about the structural problems and the reasons why we have those. But I don't love the idea of the talk of stacking anything. And notably, when you start getting into wars, you should expect that there will be some fighting back once the other party returns to power.
Great, thank you, Wilfred. Let me direct the next question to Chara. You talked about targeted advertising that's tailored to particular voters based on what's known about those voters' characteristics. So what can be done to regulate or to counteract this type of targeted advertising?
Yeah, I think this is the new frontier of election law. And right now in the United States, we are way behind. I mean, you could look at it from a personal data protection point of view, which is the way Europe looks at it. Europeans have way more right to protect their online personas than Americans do. So one approach would be to give Americans way more control over who has their data, who can keep their data, who can use their data, and in what ways. That's one approach. Another approach is through traditional campaign finance. One of the weird things about the way the law works right now is if you run an ad that has video and you run it on broadcast, it's subject to one set of regulations. And then if you run the exact same ad online, you are likely to not have any regulations at all. And that asymmetry needs to be fixed. So that could be done statutorily by Congress. They would just need to expand what counts as an electioneering communication to include digital ads. And that would give at least transparency of who is paying for these targeted ads that are impacting our election in 2020.
Great, thank you, Tara. Let me ask a question from the audience and direct it to Lee. Lee, it appears that you're pretty unsympathetic to the Electoral College and in fact, the entire American electoral system. Is it really plausible to get rid of it completely? It's clearly produced undemocratic outcomes, but what if eliminating the Electoral College itself results in unintended consequences?
Sorry, my daughter has a question for me too. She's here with me. I mean, we could get rid of the Electoral College completely. It would take a constitutional amendment to do that. We've come close on a few occasions. I don't know. I mean, certainly there's always unintended consequences in everything that we do. But there are also unintended consequences in maintaining the status quo. So, I mean, I think the idea of unintended consequences is often invoked as this sort of as this sort of warning that, don't change things because you don't know what's going to happen. But one, if you keep things the same, you also don't know what's going to happen. And two, there are unintended, there are clear consequences to maintaining the status quo, and the clear consequences are extremely destructive because we are perpetuating a system, as Wilfred said, of minority rule.
Great, thank you, Lee. One logistical point, for those of you who are seeking CLE credit for this event, please record the following code on your affirmation sheets in order to verify your attendance. This is CLE code number 3. It is 52ZDHC. Again, that's 52ZDHC, 52 Zulu Delta Hotel Charlie. Thank you. And let me direct one final, somewhat broader question to Wilfred. Wilfred, you've talked about constitutional amendment. What's your perspective on our existing Constitution? Is our existing Constitution capable of handling today's challenges to American democracy?
I've been thinking about that a lot. I think our existing Constitution has a lot of the fundamental things that we need in a good system, in a good democratic system. But as I've articulated and others have articulated, there are some things that their times have just passed. So the values of liberty and equality and the pursuit of justice and the common good, all the things that our preamble and the 14th Amendment speak about, those are great, solid foundations, bricks that we can build off of. But we've got the Constitution we've got. So I am an advocate of amending the Constitution to get rid of and reform those things whose time have come. So I do think that the Electoral College is one of those things. I think we need to rethink the whole Senate structure. Of course, that's harder because preserving the Senate status quo is in Article 5, the amending provision of the Constitution itself. I do think we need to think about the destructive influence of money in politics. The Citizens United and the Buckley decisions that it was sort of built off of have been shown to be very pernicious and nefarious. I think we need to be thinking about an explicit right to vote in the Constitution, because all we do is protect from different types of discrimination, whether it be based on race or sex or age or inability to pay. I think we need to think about just a way of making this Constitution we have and the values that we have in the preamble the foundation for a more robust multicultural democracy. So I think hopefully we get some real change in the next elections and the elections to come to actually make some of this stuff possible. But I hope that this Constitution is capable, because I think it's going to be hard to get rid of it wholesale.
Great, thank you, Wilfred. And with that, our voting and representation symposium is drawing to a close. Our thanks to Wilfred Codrington III, Lee Drutman, Chara Torres Speliski, and Cristina Sinsun Ramirez. This has been an invigorating discussion and a wonderful close to this two-day symposium. Thank you also to all of the distinguished panelists for their contributions over the course of the symposium on voting and representation. We are also grateful for the partnership of the NYU Law Review, NYU's John Brademas Center, and NYU Votes for collaborating on this program. A few final notes from the Brennan Center to bolster our democracy before we leave you. First, the census deadline is fast approaching. So if you haven't yet, please go complete your census form online at my2020census.gov. It's quick and the most efficient way to get the census done, despite the challenges of the pandemic. And tell everyone you know to make sure they get counted in 2020. Second, a number of states have begun voting by mail and early in-person voting. If you can sign up to vote by mail or participate in early voting in your state, please do so, and tell all your friends and family to do so. And if you can't vote by mail or participate in early voting in your state, call your local representative and let them know you want those options to protect your vote. If you have any questions about your CLE credits or codes, please let us know. And thank you all for coming and supporting the work of the NYU Law Review and the Brennan Center for Justice. We're grateful again to all of our panelists and to all of those who attended. We hope you learned a lot, so take care, stay safe, and vote. Thanks very much.